So both boys were subsequently charged with abduction, attempted abduction and murder. Abduction and murder for James Bulger and attempted abduction for the boy earlier that day. The boys' first appearance in court was just 10 days after the murder, where the boys were just known as Child A and Child B. Because they were just 10 years old, their identities were at first protected from the public. Outside the court that day, it was such a scene. There was hundreds of people that turned up outside that court to riot, throw things at the van, shout things, just express their general disgust and outrage and anger at this case. Like I said, it was one of the most horrific cases anyone had ever heard of in UK history. It was just disgusting, and so people turned up in their hundreds to try and express this anger. The boys' trial was set to later that year, where they would be sentenced, and again over 500 people turned up to the court that day.
There were queues outside the court because there were 44 seats available for the public to listen in, and they'd be queuing up all night to get in. It was just like a show trial.
And the dock in the courtroom where the boys would have been standing to do the trial actually had to be raised by 18 inches. They had to put a false floor in there because these were two 10-year-old boys and they couldn't see over the railings because they were so tiny. I mean, you never expect to have 10-year-olds in a courtroom for something like this, and that just shows it really, doesn't it? Like, a courtroom is made for adults. It's not made for two 10-year-old boys. In the UK, the criminal age of responsibility is 10 years old. These boys were both 10 years old. Had they been a few months younger than they were, these boys would have got off completely for this crime. They just wouldn't have been charged. It was in this trial that the details of that day before the abduction surfaced. John Venables had actually been chosen to look after the school gerbils that week. And so that day, on the 12th of February, he was on his way to school to pick up these gerbils. On his way there, he bumped into his best friend, Robert Thompson, in town. And like we know, the two of them often got into trouble together, and Thompson managed to persuade Venables into going shoplifting with him that day. The two of them went to the Strand. They were shoplifting for a bit, but they got bored. I mean, they did that a lot. And that was when Thompson turned to Venables and said, "Let's grab a kid." So Venables forgot all about his gerbils, forgot that he was supposed to be going to school, and after a failed attempt at abducting another child, the two of them eventually abducted James Bulger. They walked him around for hours, passing so many people that could have made a difference and saved this baby's life. A few of these people did stop the boys and ask them what they were doing, why this baby was crying, why he had blood on his head. But the boys had a story ready. They said that he was their little brother and he'd fallen over and they were just taking him home. On another occasion, they were stopped by a woman walking her dog, and she asked the same question, like, why is the baby crying? Why has he got blood on his head? And they said that he was lost and they didn't actually know this little baby. And they asked for directions to the nearest police station so that they could take him there. The woman gave them directions to the nearest police station and just left and let these two 10-year-old boys take a baby to the police station. It came to light in these trials, like I said, that Thompson seemed to have the leading role in the abduction, the murder, and in the torture of James Bulger, although it was Venables' idea to take him up onto the railway line. Venables said in his trial that James Bulger seemed to like him more than Robert Thompson. He would let John pick him up, let him hold his hand, whereas he wouldn't let Thompson do any of that. Thompson and Venables' trial lasted 17 days, and then a verdict was finally made. Both boys, then 11 years old, were found guilty of the murder of James Bulger, which made them the UK's youngest ever convicted murderers, because they were 10 at the time of the murder, and that is the youngest ever murderers in UK history.
When they said they were guilty, Venables knew straight away and started to cry. Thompson looked at me and just glared at me, and I just glared back at him. And then he realised that Venables was crying, so his behaviour changed and he started to cry. But I couldn't see any tears.
The judge also made the controversial decision to release the boys' real names and the boys' school pictures so that the public could identify these two boys that had done all these things to this little baby. something that is very rarely done with child criminals.
I was always against their identity being revealed. Not because of John, I wasn't bothered one iota about John, but he had a family who was completely innocent, of course.
Even though this was done, the judge also ruled that no more information about these two men as they grew up in prison and whatever, no more information could be leaked about them, and that when they left prison they would be given new identities. Both boys were sentenced to 8 years in prison. 8 years for the horrific, sadistic torture and murder of a baby. I'm sure pretty much like 99% of my audience will agree that 8 years is not enough. If you look up the details of this crime, you will know that 8 years is not enough for what they did to that little baby. And it's clear that they didn't feel remorse, they were laughing in court. So what are the chances of them getting out in 8 years' time when they're 18 years old, 19 years old, and reoffending? Like, the chances are pretty high of that. And this, as you can probably imagine, was met by complete outrage from the whole of the UK. And due to this, the boys' trials were actually reviewed, and their sentencing was increased from 8 years to 10 years. 2 more years.
Everyone was in uproar at the sentence that Thompson and Venables were given. You know, I can't thank people enough for the way they've still backed me to this day.
A national newspaper in the UK called The Sun actually started a petition to try and get the boys' sentences increased further, and this petition got over 280,000 signatures. And it worked. The government increased the boys' sentences from 10 years to 15 years, which a lot of people still believed was too short.
I wasn't pleased with it, but I would have learned to live with it. I would have said, well, you know, at the end of the day, they have done 15 years, or going to do 15 years, you know, we can't ask for more than that.
However, like I said, this second increase in the boys' sentences from 10 to 15 years was done by the government, not by criminal lawyers. And so it was deemed that it wasn't fair, the government didn't have a place to do that, and so their sentences were brought back down to 10 years.
When it got brought back down, when they said it wasn't down to Michael Howard to increase it, it was just another knife in the back. And I just thought, how much more can we take as James's family?
So now it had to be decided how the boys would be sentenced and rehabilitated, because without rehabilitation, like I said, they were likely to reoffend. Both boys were put into separate kind of child criminal rehabilitation units. It was like half prison, half rehabilitation, full of children. And while both boys were there in separate places, it was reported that both of them were experiencing PTSD from the murder. Venables particularly was suffering pretty bad with post-traumatic stress. He would have nightmares, he would have flashbacks. Thompson was experiencing it, but Venables was much more severe. Both boys had really secure accommodation, like they were always supervised. Doors would be locked before and after they would enter every room, so like they would go in, the door would be locked behind them, so none of the other prisoners were they prisoners because they were children, but none of the other children in the unit could attack them. Both boys got a good education, they had nice food, they had TVs in their rooms with video games and movies. Honestly, it was more like a hostel than it was a prison. Like, these boys were doing time for torturing and murdering a baby, and they were getting TVs and video games and movies.
I just thought, you know, what have I done to deserve this? You know, that they should be getting punished, not rewarded.
Both boys were taught how to conceal their past and their real identities, as well as having one-to-one tuition to pass GCSEs and A-levels.
There's one-on-one teaching. You know, there's people who've got to pay for that kind of education, they got it scot-free.
Like I said, it was like a hostel. These boys were getting more in this prison setting for torturing and murdering a baby. These boys had more than some poor families have. Like, some poor families don't have TVs, don't have video games or movies or one-to-one tuition for GCSEs and A-levels, whereas these boys committed such a horrific crime and they were almost being rewarded for it.
Went shopping for themselves as well, buying all kinds of designer clothes. You know, a lot of people out there work so hard and still can't afford things like that for their kids, but they, you know, they're good kids. But these two committed that crime and were given all luxuries like that, designer clothes, you know.
I actually found an interview with a boy called Leon that was in Robert Thompson's unit at the same time as him. He actually spent 5 years in there with him. He said that he knew who Robert Thompson was, everyone knew who he was, but his crime just wasn't spoken about in there.
Like one time we was all just sat there and it come up on the news, I can't remember what it was about, it showed you his picture, and like I remember the staff turned it off and he went like barging into his room and you could hear him like arguing with the staff. I can't remember what he was saying, he was just swearing at him and stuff like that.
Thompson's room in this unit had a lot of luxuries for a prison cell, you know, for someone that is serving time for murder. It literally looked like your average little boy's room, not a prison cell.
We had like Liverpool posters, they had like pictures with like lava painted like matchstick people and stuff like that. And he had like a Liverpool duvet. Just had a foot spa in his room, and like if he was lending the PC from education, he used to have that in his room as well.
And as you can imagine, to keep 2 young boys under such accommodation where they get so much, and they get like private tutors and they get a completely decorated bedroom, you can imagine it is a lot of money to keep these boys where they were.
On average, it costs somewhere in the region of £3,000 a week, but I regard that as an investment for the future. If I can effect positive change in a youngster, return them safely to the community, then perhaps we won't spend large sums of money by incarcerating them for the majority of their adult life.
But it wasn't just the boys' lives inside the unit that was causing outrage. The boys were often let out of the unit to go shopping, go to football games, meet up with family. Thompson was first let on his first day out, just a year into his sentence. A year after committing such a horrible crime, he was let out of prison for the day just to go for a walk around a park. And as of then, he would go on like monthly trips to the swimming baths. Swimming was his favourite hobby, and so he used to go there every single month, and they would get a McDonald's before returning to the unit.
I used to know we went out because like I used to say to staff, oh, where have you been? I used to say, oh, been to this shopping centre with him, stuff like that, or to the park with him or wherever.
Perhaps to a local shopping centre to buy the clothes that they need from the money that they're allowed, and that's about preparing them for a return into the community.
Which, you know, makes sense. Like, they are trying to help these people prepare for life outside of the unit. Like, obviously they're not going to be functioning members of society if they don't have this kind of help while they're in there. But I can't help but feel like they're taking the piss a bit. I'm sorry if I'm getting like unprofessional during this video. Just this bit of the case specifically just infuriates me. Like, I can't help but feel like these boys are being rewarded for torturing and murdering a baby. And they're getting all this. They're going out and buying designer clothes. They're going to McDonald's. They're going to the swimming baths. They're getting the bedroom decorated to their favourite football team. Like, it just infuriates me. It really does. I mean, there's a difference between preparing them for real life, like taking them to a shop, maybe getting them to buy like a loaf of bread, handling money, you know, and just rewarding them, giving them luxuries that they just don't deserve. I just think it's disgusting. In 1999, when both boys were 16 years old, it was decided by the European Court that their original trial in 1993 wasn't impartial. And due to this, the boys' sentences were once again reviewed. This review decided that the boys were then going to be released just 6 months later. In June of 2001, both boys were released. They were given new identities, new names, new passports, birth certificates, all that, and they were put into new secret locations that no one knew about. I read on a couple of different sources about the price for giving someone a new identity. It can cost anywhere between £250,000 and £750,000 each for both of these men to be given a new identity and a new life after committing such a horrible crime. They were both prohibited from contacting each other if they ever found out each other's new identities. They were prohibited from contacting James Bulger's family. They weren't allowed in the whole Merseyside area, and Merseyside is a county. It's a big area. They're not allowed in the whole of Merseyside. And other than reporting to a parole officer every so often, they were free men.
They couldn't get in touch with any of the family, myself or any of the family. So I thought, you know, it's a bit of comfort, but I thought, well, hang on, does that mean to say I'm a prisoner in Merseyside? Can't I venture out to Merseyside then, in case I bump into one or...
Both